13 officials, 5 offshore accounts. One nation quietly sold behind closed doors, and only one man dared to stand up. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, soldier leader, and a mirror to a broken system. But when he stepped into that cabinet room with a file full of secrets and a list of names, it wasn't politics anymore. It was war. One by one, the lights flickered. The projector came on. Evidence spilled across the walls. Bank transfers, rebel camps, government seals on crates that were never meant to be seen. Ministers gasped. A few reached for their pens. Others reached for the door. But the truth had arrived and it didn't knock. This isn't just a political thriller. It's a story about betrayal, power, and the price of silence. What you're about to hear is a work of fiction. But in a world where silence often protects the guilty and truth gets buried under diplomacy, sometimes fiction feels more honest than fact. So ask yourself, if the system was bleeding, would you clean it? Or keep selling the bandages? Let's begin. Steam curled from porcelain cups, tracing lazy spirals toward a ceiling painted with fading colonial flourishes. Somewhere in the corner, an old brass clock ticked too loudly for a room meant for quiet power. It was Tuesday, always the slow day. Ministers shuffled papers, skimmed budget lines, whispered about exchange rates and weekend polo matches. The scent of imported coffee mingled with polished mahogany and the faint citrus of a minister's cologne. Nothing here said crisis. Everything said routine. Then the door didn't open, it detonated. President Ibrahim Traoré crossed the threshold like a storm breaking glass. No entourage, no aid, only the sharp geometry of his pressed uniform and a beret tilted with bone-level precision. The room's oxygen seemed to vanish. Chairs scraped. 12 ministers sprang to their feet in a ragged wave, unsure whether to salute or shrink. Traoré said nothing. He didn't nod. He didn't blink. He simply let the silence expand until it pushed every heartbeat against rib cages. His boots clicked once on the marble, and that single echo sounded like a gavel slamming down on years of complacency. He remained standing at the head of the table, an empty leather chair behind him, a national flag looming taller than usual at his shoulder. A junior minister, eyes wide, began to offer the customary greeting. Traoré raised one finger, not in welcome, but in warning, and the words died in the man's throat. "This isn't a meeting," he finally said, voice as calm as a covered blade. "It's an inquest." No one sat. The wall at his back hummed. A projector, ancient whirring, blinked awake. First there was static, then a frame of desert dusk, a rebel encampment in the Sahel fires glowing like malignant stars. A ton crate appeared next, stamped with the crisp seal of the Ministry of Rural Development, the very same emblem engraved on the pens resting in front of these officials. A spoon clinked against a saucer louder than it should have been. Someone's phone vibrated on silent rattling like a nervous insect against polished wood. The Prime Minister cleared his throat, a practiced gesture, but the sound cracked halfway out as the image zoomed closer. Serial numbers, shipping dates, signatures. Traoré didn't bother to look at the screen. He'd memorized every pixel. He looked at faces instead, reading micro-twitches, the widening of pupils, the subtle retreat of shoulders. Each reaction wrote a confession across skin and bone. Behind him, the slideshow bled into a second photo satellite. Capture midnight green. Armored pickups. Children in flip-flops, cradling rifles, taller than they were. A red circle highlighted a stack of medical crates meant for a cholera clinic that had never opened. Apparently, Traoré said, letting the words drop like stones, "Our humanitarian aid walks faster than our doctors." A bead of sweat cut a precise path down the temple of Minister Salif Dio, a man famous for never perspiring under pressure. Traoré tracked the droplet with the detachment of a surgeon. Then he flicked his gaze to a lone USB drive on the table, its plastic shell dull under fluorescent light. Inside this, he continued, are bank ledgers, phone transcripts, and flight manifest, proof that somebody in this room has been feeding children bullets and calling it development. Gasps were swallowed, not expelled. Even the clock seemed to hesitate between seconds. Another sleight of handshake captured by a long-lens camera outside a beachfront villa. Western diplomat on the left, Burkina Bay suit on the right. Date stamped 2 weeks ago. The villa's balcony overlooked an ocean most citizens of Burkina Faso would never see. Traoré leaned forward, palms flat on the table shoulders, squared like a wall about to fall on someone. "Tell me," he said softly, "how many kilometers of road could that balcony have paved?" No answer, just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the flutter of a single page in an open binder, as if the document itself were trying to flee. Somewhere outside, a bird called twice, then stopped. From behind Traoré, a soldier materialized, face hidden by a black balaclava rifle, slung but not raised. His arrival was quiet, yet the message boomed exit routes were closed. Traoré straightened. In a moment he said, "We will speak of names. Before that I offer a courtesy." He gestured to the stack of blank resignation letters placed near the door, paper white as confession. "Take one now and history may remember you as cowards. Stay and history may remember you as criminals. Choose quickly. The nation is waiting." The projector clicked to a black screen. The only light came from the hallway stretching across the threshold like dawn, or perhaps a firing line. Either way, nobody moved, not yet, because the next image, the one still hidden in Traoré's pocket, carried a date stamp from yesterday. And every soul in that room suddenly realized the president hadn't come to negotiate their loyalty. He'd come to measure the distance between silence and guilt, and the tape was already spooling. The silence after the last image lingered, like smoke thick, sour, impossible to wave away. No one spoke. No one dared to shift in their seats. It was as if the projector had not only burned secrets onto the wall, but scorched something into the air itself. President Traoré reached into the file he'd brought, a leather folder, weathered at the edges, the kind carried not by bureaucrats, but by men who've marched through sand and blood. He opened it with care, almost reverence, and laid its contents across the table like a priest unveiling relics. No emotion, no announcement, just paper photos, timestamps, wire transfers, maps with coordinates and red dots that meant death. He began reading, not dramatically, methodically, coldly. Account numbers linked to foreign banks in the Cayman Islands, Malta and Dubai. Transaction logs detailing funds diverted from infrastructure budgets to consulting firms that didn't exist. Wire transfers routed through shell companies with names like Golden Horizon Partners and Burkina Smart Logistics. He didn't need to explain. The names spoke for themselves. Then came the photos, grainy at first like distant memories, government trucks unloading crates in shadowed forests, a convoy pulling away at dawn, officials embracing men with covered faces. And then one photo, crystal clear, paused, the room's collective breath, a private dinner. White wine, French plates, a Western embassy official smiling across the table at Minister Salif Dio. The name fell from Traoré's mouth with surgical precision. Salif Dio. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The sound alone cracked the air like thunder. Dio flinched barely perceptibly. His jaw stiffened. He reached for the papers in front of him, perhaps out of instinct, perhaps, to find something to hide behind. But there was nothing there to save him. The next document revealed a GPS log, 2 late-night movements from Dio's ministry vehicle to a remote airstrip. Both trips corresponded to rebel activity surges 48 hours later. Traoré lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Dio. "The crates were marked as school supplies," he said quietly, "but they delivered more rifles than textbooks." Dio stood suddenly, his chair screeching against the marble. A minister to his left startled. Dio's voice broke into the silence, hoarse and defensive. "This is political theater, manufactured lies." But the words sounded hollow even to himself. He made a move toward the exit, a limp attempt at escape wrapped in indignation. But he didn't get far. 2 masked guards, silent as smoke, stepped into his path. Their faces unreadable, their rifles slung but very real. Dio halted mid-stride, somewhere between defiance and collapse. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "This isn't exile, minister. This is justice." The word landed hard, not theatrical final. Dio looked around the room, searching for an ally. Not one hand moved, not one eye met his. The silence wasn't support, it was abandonment. The kind reserved for men who'd spent years above consequence, now caught beneath it. As the guard stepped forward, he didn't resist. He just whispered something under his breath, inaudible, maybe a name, maybe a curse, and then he disappeared through the door he once walked through like a king. Traoré turned to the rest of the table. "One name," he said, but not the only one. He let that hang sharp, deliberate. Then he tapped a second folder on the table, thicker than the first. The ministers sat straighter. Some paled. Others clenched their jaws in a silent chorus of guilt, fear, and calculation. The purge had not begun with Salif Dio. It had merely introduced the temperature of truth, and the room was just beginning to sweat. The room held its breath as if unsure whether what had just happened was real or still part of some theater too elaborate to be believed. The masked guards who had blocked Minister Salif Dio's exit didn't flinch, didn't speak. But now from the far side of the hall, boots echoed with deliberate weight, a sound that cut through the tension like a blade. A military officer in full-dress uniform stepped into view. He wasn't young. His walk had the measured calm of someone who'd faced war, not politics. His name was Colonel Soleiman Bako, a loyalist known not for speeches, but for doing what needed to be done. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. The ministers didn't look at him. They looked away. TRAORÉ didn't have to issue the command. None was needed. Bako approached Dio, who had now stiffened into a posture that tried but failed to resemble dignity. His tie was askew, his breath visible in shallow bursts. He muttered something again, maybe protest, maybe prayer, but Bako didn't pause. With smooth, practiced motion, he withdrew a folded arrest warrant from his chest pocket and held it just long enough for Dio's trembling eyes to focus on the seal. The seal wasn't of the Ministry of Justice. It bore the emblem of the presidency. Without ceremony, Bako gestured. The guards stepped in. Hands took hold of Dio's wrists, not roughly, but firmly. A subtle click followed. The sound of power rediscovered. Gasps fluttered like moths across the table. One minister knocked over his teacup. Another instinctively looked at the door, measuring distance, risk, and reality. But no one moved. This wasn't a rumor. This was real. And it was happening in the palace in daylight, under the eyes of everyone who once thought themselves untouchable. Dio didn't fight. His voice was gone. The image of him standing there, wrists cuffed, shoulders hunched under the weight of consequence, burned itself into the minds of everyone watching. Here was a man who only weeks ago had laughed off opposition reports and hosted private dinners with foreign delegates. Now he was escorted out like a criminal because he was one. As the door closed behind him, a hollow silence returned. It didn't last long. Across the table, Minister Jean-Louis Tambi, once an ally of Dio and rumored to be next in line for questioning, reached into his briefcase. Fingers trembling only slightly, he retrieved a single sheet of paper. It had been pre-folded, pre-signed. He slid it across the table toward TRAORÉ without looking up. His voice cracked as he whispered, "For the good of the country." TRAORÉ didn't touch the letter. He didn't nod or acknowledge the gesture. He simply looked at it long enough to let Tambi know that this resignation would not be treated as an escape. The projector behind him, still casting a dim gray light on the wall, gave a soft, mechanical hum, then powered down with a fading whir. The images of rebel camps, sealed crates, and satellite maps dissolved into darkness, but their ghosts lingered in the minds of those present. No one reached for their coffee anymore. The temperature in the room had dropped, but the sweat on brows had just begun to rise. TRAORÉ finally broke the silence. "No traitor," he said slowly, "is too powerful to fall." He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to, because the real message wasn't in the tone. It was in the stillness of the room, in the tightened throats, in the way every eye avoided his. They understood now this wasn't a purge whispered in back rooms or executed through memos. This was happening here, now, in public. And it was only just beginning. The first domino had fallen. The rest would hear the echo. The sky over Kuruma had always been generous, wide open, blistering in the dry months, heavy with promise in the wet season. It was early afternoon, the sun perched high like a silent overseer. Rice fields rippled in shades of green and gold, glistening with water that reflected clouds as children splashed between furrows, chasing dragonflies and laughter. Mothers carried baskets. Elders dozed under mango trees. There was no hint, none, that in less than an hour everything would burn. A faint metallic groan rippled through the earth, almost imperceptible at first. Then a sharp hiss. Birds scattered. The ground trembled slightly beneath a rusting pipeline that ran like a vein just outside the village boundary, an artery of fuel stretching hundreds of kilometers from depots to distant industrial zones. It had been there for years, unguarded, forgotten, and quietly leaking. But this time the leak wasn't slow. It was sudden, deliberate. With a noise like the tearing of the sky, the pipeline ruptured. A column of diesel burst upward, drenching crops, soil, and skin. Children screamed, slipping in the slick as adults rushed forward. Some thought it was an earthquake. Others thought it was sabotage. But no one was ready for what came next. A spark. No one knew its source, maybe a nearby cook fire, maybe static from a worker's boot, or maybe something more intentional. But the result was the same. In a heartbeat, the field became an inferno. Fire tore through the paddies, devouring stalks and straw huts alike. Screams rose above the crackle, turning the air itself into a wall of heat and terror. A mother dragged her child by the arm, her skin blistering with every step. A young boy, no older than 10, beat at his shirt already in flames. Livestock ran wild, some already ablaze, their cries echoing into the trees. By the time trucks from the nearest town arrived, it was too late. Kuruma was gone. The media called it a rebel attack. News anchors in air-conditioned studios showed blurry drone footage and cited unverified intelligence. Official statements followed. "We condemn this heinous act of terror. Investigations are underway." But no one came. No aid. No grief counselors. Just cameras, then silence. But Traoré did come. He didn't bring reporters. He brought investigators, real ones. The Bureau of Internal Risk and Resource Theft, a unit newly formed under his administration, arrived under the cover of night. Their boots sank into scorched mud. Their drones hovered low, scanning burn patterns. Their hands collected samples, ash-twisted metal fragments of industrial fittings. And what they found changed everything. First, the cut, not a rupture from pressure or degradation, but a precision-engineered breach. Someone had accessed the pipeline intentionally. Second, valves still hot, still open, fitted with unregistered tap lines designed to extract fuel in high volume. Finally, GPS data from a nearby service road showed repeated visits by the same government-issued vehicle assigned to the Department of Rural Infrastructure Logistics. It wasn't rebels, it was theft. Fuel siphoned under the guise of maintenance, redirected and sold through black market routes. When the loadout failed and the siphon pressure overloaded, the thieves fled. The leak was left to build. And someone, maybe the same thieves, maybe an accomplice, sparked the fire to erase the evidence. But they didn't erase everything. Traoré stood on the edge of what was once a village. He knelt in the ash, sifting through it with gloved fingers. A half-burned school book, its pages melted at the edges, bore a child's handwriting math equations. Doodles a stick figure of a house that no longer stood. He held it for a moment. "We say rebels because it's easier than saying we failed," he murmured, to no one in particular. One of his aides stepped forward, whispering a name. Traoré didn't react. He simply nodded once and handed the charred notebook to the man. "Add it to the evidence file." From the blackened soil beneath Kuruma, a new list had begun to form. Names, dates, license plates. The village was gone. But the story of its destruction was very much alive. And this time it wouldn't be buried under politics. The palace mailroom had seen strange things before: angry letters, anonymous tips, even a live chicken once during an election year. But this package was different. It arrived wrapped in coarse fabric, tied with a nylon string, and marked in thick charcoal for the president's hands only. It had no return address, just a smudged postal stamp from a provincial market in Bugariba. When the staff opened it, they found a bag of rice sealed in a blue UN World Food Program sack. Old, torn slightly near the seam, and with it folded inside a faded receipt stained with oil and sweat. No letter, no explanation, just numbers scrawled on the back in trembling handwriting. This fed 5, not 50. The bag should have been in a refugee camp 2 provinces away, but it was instead found for sale openly at a market stall beside cheap soap and counterfeit medicine. The receipt, issued by the Ministry of Social Resettlement, was traced within hours. Serial coded, real, stamped by an official still on payroll. President Ibrahim Traoré read the details in silence. He didn't react outwardly, but those who knew him recognized the change. His grip tightened around the faded receipt like a vice. Then came the order, delivered with calm finality: summon Minister Nadine Boro. Nadine arrived the next morning dressed in navy blue and wrapped in silk confidence. She had spent a decade mastering the art of polished deflection, perfect diction, impeccable posture, and a gaze trained to never blink first. Her ministry handled welfare logistics, refugee aid, and foreign supply coordination. Her signature appeared on everything from water tank orders to winter blankets. She entered the presidential office smiling, expecting formality. What she met was cold steel. Traoré did not offer coffee. He did not gesture for her to sit. The rice bag sat in the center of his desk, sagging slightly. The receipt beside it protected in a clear evidence sleeve. He didn't raise his voice. He simply began. This bag should have reached Camp 19 in Kosi. Instead, it ended up beside mangoes and knockoff Panadol in Bugariba's open market. Nadine tilted her head slightly, not alarmed yet. There are over 40 subcontractors between the capital and that camp. Theft along the chain is regrettably common. We've filed dozens of internal reviews. This bag's batch was delivered last Tuesday. Traoré cut in. The market vendor received it Thursday. That's not a breakdown in logistics. That's a handoff. Nadine's lips parted, then closed. Her mind flickered through possible denials, plausible ones, but Traoré continued before she could regroup. He tapped the receipt, then held up a second document. Wire transfers. 4 of them. Each one routed to an account under the name Abdoulaye Kone, your personal driver. She blinked. The amounts matched the value of 3 rice shipments and a WFP medical pallet that never made it past the depot, he added. She exhaled softly, almost a whisper. If someone in my staff, you didn't sign the theft, Minister Traoré said, voice, low, deadly. You allowed it. It wasn't just the rice or the money. It was the lie. The quiet betrayal buried in paperwork, shielded by bureaucracy, brushed off as inefficiency. And now in a country scorched by hunger and conflict, even one missing bag echoed louder than a gunshot. Nadine's confidence cracked just slightly, a tremble at the corner of her mouth. She glanced at the receipt, then at Traoré, as if hoping for a lifeline. There was none. Justice isn't just for rebels and generals, Traoré said. It's for those who trade silence for comfort. No guards entered, not yet. But she knew. Her time was no longer measured in meetings. It was being counted in evidence files and witness statements. 1 bag of rice, 1 driver's greed, 1 minister's blind eye. Sometimes revolutions didn't begin with rifles. They started with a meal that never reached the hungry. The next morning, Nadine Borro sat alone in an antechamber deep within the presidential wing. No aides, no phone, no makeup. The polished veneer that had long protected her was gone, stripped away by the weight of something heavier than accusation, consequence. The room was quiet, save for the occasional tick of an old wall clock and the distant shuffle of security boots along stone floors. She didn't touch the water bottle placed beside her. Her hands were still folded neatly in her lap, like a schoolgirl waiting for discipline. When President Traoré entered, he did not sit across from her. He stood by the window instead, watching the courtyard below, where guards trained in silence and gardeners trimmed hedges that lined the path to the flagpole. Then, without turning, he gave her the only 2 options she'd been summoned for: an internal audit with full cooperation, or a public trial under military tribunal. The words were delivered flat, with no threat, no malice, just certainty. Nadine blinked slowly. Her fingers tightened around each other. Will I be prosecuted either way? She asked, voice thin. Traoré turned then. He didn't answer immediately. He walked to the desk and laid 2 folders in front of her. One was thin, containing the audit authorization. The other was heavier, its spine thick with compiled evidence, documents, receipts, testimonies, financial trails. The weight of it made the desk creak slightly beneath it. He simply said, "It's your choice." For a long moment, Nadine didn't move. Then, with a breath that sounded almost like release, she reached for the thinner folder. "I'll resign," she said, quietly. "Cooperate fully with the audit. I won't make a scene." Traoré gave a single nod, nothing more. But just as she began signing the first page, her hand froze mid-stroke. Her eyes, tired, now met his. "Will they believe I tried to help?" she asked, not defensively, not to escape blame, just softly, almost like a confession. Traoré looked at her for a long, unreadable second. Then he answered, not with comfort, but with clarity. "It's not about belief anymore. It's about proof." The pen clicked shut. The paper slid across the table. Nadine rose, slowly collected her bag, and walked out under the gaze of two guards. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Her fall had already begun before the arrest came. That afternoon, a press bulletin went out. It was short, bureaucratic, deliberately unsensational. The Minister of Social Resettlement has tendered her resignation and will cooperate fully with an ongoing internal audit into supply chain discrepancies related to international aid distribution. But outside the walls of the palace, the resignation made a louder sound. In the markets of Bugariba, women whispered her name with mixed tones, some in anger, others in disappointment, fewer in defense. In the refugee camps where the rice never arrived, no one said her name at all. Instead, they talked about the mothers, the ones who had waited in line for flour and left with empty bowls, the ones who traded earrings for second-hand antibiotics when the medicine truck stopped coming, the ones who buried children quietly not from war but from waiting too long for help that was promised. One mother in Camp 19, interviewed by a young reporter, summed it up best. "I don't care who signed what she said," cradling her youngest on her hip. "I only care who let my son die." And that was the truth TRAORÉ understood better than most. Names could be argued, motives debated. But when hunger came, it did not wait for trial. It arrived with a hollow belly and left with a silence no courtroom could undo. In the halls of power, Barrow's signature now sat in a file. But outside, under the sun, among the dust and grief, proof had already passed its verdict. The palace guards didn't stop her at first. She was just a girl, barely 16 by the look of her, standing in front of the main gate, in a faded school uniform. Her white blouse slightly wrinkled, her navy skirt dusted from the morning wind. A canvas backpack hung loosely from one shoulder. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling. She was simply waiting. When one of the guards finally approached, she didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her backpack and removed a single item, a red notebook worn around the edges, its spine held together with a rubber band. No envelope, no message, just the notebook. "This is for President TRAORÉ," she said softly. "Please make sure he sees it himself. No one else." The guard hesitated, unsure what to make of her, but there was something in her voice, a calm that was too calm, a gravity beyond her years. He took the notebook, carefully asked for her name. She gave only a first name, Amina, then turned and walked away before they could stop her. Not in a rush, just finished. Inside the presidential office, TRAORÉ had grown used to receiving letters. Some were warnings, some were threats. Many were anonymous grievances from across the country. But when his aide placed the red notebook on his desk, something about its simplicity felt different. He opened it slowly, peeling back the brittle rubber band. The first page was filled with faces, drawings done in pencil, surprisingly skilled, each with names scrawled beneath. Ministers, businessmen, a man in uniform with foreign sunglasses, another in a suit with a distinct scar above his brow. Some were smiling, some frowning. All were real. The second page began like a diary, not dated, not orderly, but full of snippets, overheard conversations, and observations scribbled quickly, as if between homework and hiding. Phrases like, "He said the crates would disappear before inspection." "USB passed at hotel lobby. I saw it. Western guy, black car, no plates." They laughed when the school closed. Said it didn't matter. It was just a cover. TRAORÉ read in silence, and then he read it again, and then one more time. There were no official seals, no stamped evidence. But something about the words, the urgency, the rawness, carried a kind of truth that no investigation ever could. There was a sketch of a corridor notes on who entered a specific office late at night, a list of initials tied to coded payments. And in the margins, dates, locations, rumors she overheard but hadn't yet understood. On the final page, in large handwriting, she had written a single sentence. Not in anger, not in pride, just clarity. "I didn't want to be a hero. I just didn't want to be like them." TRAORÉ closed the notebook and sat back in his chair, eyes fixed on nothing. The hum of the ceiling fan above faded into background noise. Outside, the call to midday prayer echoed through the city, but he didn't move. In a world full of corruption masked by protocol, where adults wrapped their crimes in paperwork and policy, it was the words of a teenage girl that pierced deeper than any investigation. He held the notebook like it was fragile, sacred. Somewhere out there, this girl Amina had risked everything. Not for revenge, not for glory, but for something purer. something that had become rare in these halls decency. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. Get the intelligence unit, quietly, and find her. The notebook didn't have blood, it didn't have fingerprints, but it had names, places, and intention, and sometimes the most dangerous weapon in a collapsing system wasn't a rifle. It was the truth written in a girl's handwriting, in red ink. The red notebook moved like contraband through the palace halls. No copies, no scans. Only trusted eyes read it once carefully and then passed it on. Each name written in Amina's neat, hurried script became a spark. But one name burned hotter than the rest. Mahamadou Keita, Deputy Minister of Commerce. His name had appeared twice, once beneath a sketch face and again beside a single explosive line. He said he'll leak the contract files to Brussels if they try to block the fund. It might have been dismissed except for what followed. A second source came forward. An intern barely out of university had read Amina's story in the paper and recognized the man. She had also seen him at the ministry late on weekends, printing pages, scanning documents, whispering into phone calls in a language she didn't speak, but couldn't forget French but not local dialect. European, fluent, calm. She remembered the phrase he'd muttered to himself, thinking no one was listening. By the time they noticed, the EU will already have it. That was enough. Within an hour, Keita's office was sealed. 2 soldiers stood outside, weapons lowered but present. Technicians moved in quickly. Hard drives were cloned files, boxed passwords reset. The door, once gold-lettered with his title, now bore a plain, white sticker. Under investigation. Presidential authority. President Ibrahim Traoré summoned the full cabinet. No conference hall this time. No water bottles or polite smiles. Just a circle of chairs beneath a dim skylight in a private chamber, the kind used during wartime or state funerals. The red notebook rested in Traoré's hands as he entered, its edges worn slightly more than the day before. He didn't sit. He stood at the center and read aloud. He didn't choose the most incriminating parts first. He chose the small ones, the sketches, the side notes, the way Amina had written down facial expressions, patterns, passing jokes. She had watched them not with malice but with clarity. She had seen what they hadn't or refused to. Page 42. Traoré said, flipping gently. Deputy Keita laughed when he said the Europeans will pay more if they feel guilty. Page 53. He told the driver to take him to the Belgian consulate, not the ministry. No briefcase, just a flash drive in his jacket. Murmurs. Shifting. One minister adjusted his tie. Another rubbed his forehead. Traoré snapped the notebook shut. She saw what you refused to report. No one spoke. There was no defense. Some looked down, others glanced sideways, calculating. And one minister, Kayete, whose name hadn't yet appeared in the notebook, but whose department often crossed with Keita's, clenched his jaw and stared at the floor like it might open beneath him. Traoré let the silence grow roots before he continued. We built this house with the people's trust, and some of you have been renting rooms to foreign bidders. He walked slowly across the chamber, not looking at anyone in particular. You called her a child. She was, but she paid more attention than any of you. She carried no title, no salary, no seat at this table. But she risked her life for this table. He placed the notebook at the center. Now you'll read it too. One by one, the ministers approached reluctantly, reverently, as if touching a holy relic or a loaded weapon, and in many ways it was both. Not just a girl's diary, but a mirror, cracked but honest. Mahamadou Keita had not yet been arrested, but the door had closed behind him, and the girl who had drawn his face had opened every other door. The red diary was now stored in a temperature-controlled vault beneath the presidential archives. It had been scanned page by page under strict supervision, cataloged in encrypted files, and backed up in 3 separate locations, including one out of the country. The real copy, the one with the smudged fingerprints, the pencil strokes, the raw human handwriting, was handled like a state artifact, because that's what it had become. Its arrival had changed everything. President Traoré had read it enough times to remember entire passages, not just the names but the emotions. The guilt between lines, the courage that trembled under ink. And he understood something crucial. If one girl with no access and no authority could collect that much truth, then there had to be others, silently watching, quietly listening, afraid to speak but desperate to be heard. So he moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, the Witness Protection Bureau was officially created, an agency independent from the Justice Ministry, reporting only to the Office of the President. It would have no uniforms, no televised budget hearings, and no political appointees. Just investigators, legal observers, encrypted communication lines, and a singular mission: protect the voices too small to survive alone. The announcement was brief. No fanfare, no press conference, just a quiet mention in the Government Gazette in a sealed executive order. But across the country, word spread fast. Whispers in crowded markets, notes passed in classrooms, parents pulling their children aside and saying, if you ever see something, now there's someone who'll listen. And then came the question of Fanta. That was her full name, Fanta Amina Sori, revealed only after confirmation and consent. It turned out she had used only Amina to protect herself, a middle name, borrowed from a great aunt she admired. She lived with her older sister in a rented apartment on the edge of a dusty provincial town. Her father had died in a border raid when she was 8. Her mother, a rice seller, passed during the cholera outbreak 2 years before. She had no lawyer, no political sponsor. She didn't even own a smartphone. When the officials from the presidency came to meet her, they brought a formal envelope. Inside, an offer letter. Full scholarship through university, room board transportation, private security if needed, an untraceable phone, and the option to move abroad under a new identity if she ever felt unsafe. Fanta took the envelope gently and read it twice. Then she looked up and said something that caught everyone in the room off guard. No photos. I don't want my face on screens or papers. Just keep watching when I'm not there. The room went still. There was no performance in her voice, no pride, just the clarity of someone who had seen what the world could do to those who spoke too loudly, too early. She wasn't rejecting safety. She was choosing anonymity, not to hide but to remain free of the spectacle. They granted her request. No official portraits, no stage thank you ceremonies. Only a quiet handover of the scholarship documents and a line in a government file marked Level 1 protection. Voluntary witness. Back in the capital, President TRAORÉ stood before the cabinet again, this time holding a printed copy of the diary's final quote. She asked for nothing but silence and eyes that stay open. He taped it to the inside of his briefing folder. That day, when he addressed the Intelligence Bureau, he didn't speak of security or risk. He said only this: from now on, every hidden voice that risks the light will have a place to land. We don't need heroes. We need people who refuse to look away. The purge had begun with arrests, but now it had evolved into something harder to stop: an army of witnesses, led quietly by a girl who simply paid attention. The Grand Palais in Brussels shimmered beneath a ceiling of crystal chandeliers, polished stone floors echoing with the precise clicks of diplomatic shoes. Security stood at every entrance, badges flashed beneath spotlights, translators prepared headsets in a dozen languages. It was the opening morning of the West Africa Development Summit, a gathering of powerful voices: the European Union, the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, and the usual chorus of Western diplomats, advisors, and corporate representatives. France's delegation was seated front and center, their tailored suits and rehearsed smiles radiating quiet control. Beside them, the World Bank team organized portfolios thicker than any treaty. Behind them, cameras rotated silently, ready to record what the world would later edit into soundbites: stability, investment, cooperation. The nameplates on the long semicircular table gleamed under the lights: Niger, Ivory Coast, Mali, Ghana, and others. But one seat sat empty. Its plaque read, Burkina Faso. A murmur spread slowly across the room like ripples from a dropped coin. Delegates whispered, advisors glanced toward the double doors, but they remained shut. There was no entourage, no flag, no President TRAORÉ. At exactly 9:05 a.m., a young man in a dark suit stepped forward, mid-30s, calm but unsmiling. He wore no country's flag, no diplomatic pin, but his badge read, Presidential Office of Burkina Faso. He approached the speaker's podium carrying only a slim black folder. The moderator, surprised but composed, nodded permission. He opened the folder and began to read, his voice clear and unflinching. To the convened representatives of the international community, TRAORÉ President Ibrahim Traoré, send my respects but not my attendance. For too many years, we have sat in rooms like this one where our futures are discussed in languages we do not choose, under frameworks we did not design, and for priorities that are not always our own. We are given seats but not always voices, promises but not always fairness. We are told to fight corruption while being offered loans that deepen dependency. We are urged to sign contracts while our clinics lack medicine and our schools leak when it rains. The hall was silent now. Even the translators paused before resuming. Burkina Faso will no longer attend summits where accountability is expected of the weak, but not of the powerful. We will engage, yes, but on equal ground, with dignity, with truth. He flipped the page, then continued. When the oil companies who profit from our land answer the same audits our teachers face, when the development banks ask where every cent goes after it leaves Brussels, when decisions about Africa include African tongues and not only French accents, then we will join you. But until then, we are building something else. Not isolation, not defiance, but sovereignty. A pause. The aide looked up for the first time. We'll join, he said, closing the folder. When truth is spoken, not just French. The line hit the room like a dropped curtain. The message was not theatrical, it was deliberate, sharp, measured, and very, very public. Some delegates looked offended, others impressed. A few scribbled frantic notes, but none clapped. There was no applause, just a long, uncomfortable silence as the aide bowed, slightly turned, and walked out, leaving the seat still empty, but now louder than any occupied one. Later that day, headlines clashed around the world. TRAORÉ snubs West Africa summit in stunning statement. Burkina Faso rejects Francophone monopoly in global development talks. Empty chair, full message. Traoré's letter goes viral. But back home in Ouagadougou, the streets were quiet, not out of shame, but pride. In classrooms and cafes, people read the words again and again, passing phones, reciting the last line like a mantra. We'll join when truth is spoken, not just French. That day, Traoré met with farmers, not bankers. His schedule included no ribbon cuttings, no interviews. But his absence from the room in Brussels had been more powerful than any speech within it. The world had called a summit, but Burkina Faso called its own terms. The room was smaller than the summit hall in Brussels. No cameras, no press. Just polished wood, muted drapes, and the hush of old power negotiating behind closed doors. The men seated across from President Ibrahim Traoré were not elected officials. They wore no flags. Their suits were identical in shade and subtle tailoring, their voices smooth, practiced in the art of making a deal sound like salvation. One of them smiled as he slid a thick folder across the table. $3.7 billion, he said simply. Development aid, energy infrastructure, schools, all fast-tracked, all clean, no delays. He waited for applause, or at least approval. Traoré didn't move. He kept his eyes on the folder, but didn't open it. His fingers rested on its edge like it was something flammable. Another man leaned forward, voice softer, almost reassuring. It's not just about the money. It's about restoring trust. We need stability. You need results. These investigations, these audits, they're creating discomfort, freezing certain partnerships. This offer is a way forward. A long pause followed. The only condition, the first man added more carefully now, is a pause. On the probes, on the inquiries, let the system breathe. Let things normalize. It wasn't spoken as a threat, but the terms were clear. $3.7 billion for silence. Traoré sat back in his chair. For a moment he looked almost tired. Not surprised, not angry. Just weary in a way that only those who have seen too much behind closed doors ever are. Then he spoke. Slowly, calmly, but with each word heavier than steel. You think I fear poverty, he said, but what I fear is betrayal in a tailored suit. One of the men shifted in his seat, the smile beginning to crack. You think roads without justice are progress. Clinics built on silence are mercy. You dress bribes as cooperation. And every time we bleed, you hand us gauze with a price tag. Now Traoré reached for the folder, not to read it, just to push it gently back across the table. You want my silence, my government's silence. You want us to pretend the rot isn't there. That the children who died from stolen medicine were just statistics? That the rebels with our weapons are ghosts with no suppliers? His voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room did. Let me say it clearly, gentlemen. We are not for sale. Our dignity is not negotiable, and your billions, stacked as high as your excuses, will never buy back what was lost in Kuruma, in Camp 19, in the eyes of a girl with a red notebook. The last words hung in the air like a match above gasoline. He stood. Chairs scraped quietly. One of the officials reached for a prepared statement. Another cleared his throat, ready to counter with figures and forecasts. But TRAORÉ was already walking toward the door. Before he reached it, he paused just for a second and turned. "If you truly wanted stability," he said without looking back, "you would have brought justice instead of a checkbook." Then he left. Behind him, the room was still. The folder remained on the table, untouched, unopened. No one reached for it again. Back in Ouagadougou, the people would never hear the full details of what was offered or what was refused. But they'd see no ribbon cuttings, no sudden windfalls, no suspicious handshakes with men in Navy suits. And they would know. Their president hadn't sold them. He had walked out of the room with empty hands but full integrity. Because in a world still trying to buy silence, TRAORÉ had just proven that dignity has no price tag. At first it was just an empty chair. One seat among dozens left unoccupied at a summit thousands of miles away, its polished wood and brass plaque quietly ignored as cameras zoomed in on handshakes and headlines. But back in Ouagadougou, something strange began to happen. People noticed. Someone printed the image from a news clipping, a wide shot of the summit table nameplates lined up in shining rows. There near the center, Burkina Faso sat untouched, a symbol of absence, or something louder. Someone taped the image to a school wall. Another drew it in charcoal on the back of a transport truck. By the end of the week, that single empty chair had become an icon. Then came the murals. It started on the side of a shuttered library in Bobo Dioulasso. A young art student painted a towering image, a lone wooden chair under golden light, facing away from the viewer, casting a long shadow across cracked ground. On the chair's backrest, she painted the words, "We left it empty so our voice could fill it." In Koudougou, another appeared, this time with President Traoré's silhouette standing beside the chair arms, crossed a quiet storm in his stance. Beneath it, in block letters, "You don't have to sit at every table, especially when it's already bought." By month's end, the murals had spread to over a dozen cities. Some were subtle, tucked behind community centers or near bus stops. Others were bold, spanning entire rooftops. And still no one ordered them to stop. In classrooms, chalk scribbles began to appear at the corners of blackboards. Quotes, paraphrased lines from Traoré's letter. Writings that weren't part of the curriculum, but couldn't be erased. A teacher in Wahiguya found one at the top of her board one morning. "Will come when truth is spoken." Not just French. She didn't wipe it off. At a vocational school in Banfra, a 12-year-old boy named Daouda finished his math exercise early. On the back of the worksheet, he wrote, "We don't trade dignity for development." When his teacher asked where he heard it, he simply pointed at the wall behind her, where someone had drawn a chair in pencil, crooked but unmistakable. Local newspapers picked up the story. Headlines read, "The chair that spoke louder than a speech." Traoré's absence sparks artistic uprising. From Brussels to Bobo, the chair that echoed. But it wasn't just art. It was memory made visible. In a nation long told to take what it could get, even at the cost of its voice, the idea that walking away could be an act of strength had touched a collective nerve. In neighborhoods where electricity cut out nightly, young people lit candles and talked about leadership, about pride, about what it meant to be heard without begging. Even critics of the administration found themselves pausing grudgingly, admitting that the symbolism had landed deeper than any televised speech could. In Traoré, he said nothing. He didn't repost the murals, didn't commission new ones. He simply let the image breathe, let the people interpret it as their own. Because it was. It wasn't about one man or one summit. It was about the decision not to sell your seat and what that silence could say when spoken through 1,000 voices. The chair remained empty, but in streets and schools, on crumbling walls and fresh notebooks, its echo kept growing. And in that echo, a question formed, one that would shape a generation. What's the use of sitting if you can't speak? The gold mine at Biracora had once been a fortress of steel and neon-guarded gates, floodlights that buzzed through the night drone patrols watching over trucks that rolled in and out with dust-caked urgency. It had been run by Orvalis Metals, a European conglomerate, with shiny brochures, polished boots, and promises of prosperity. They paid just enough wages to keep the protests quiet, donated just enough textbooks to keep the cameras rolling, and signed just enough contracts to silence the press. Then the purge began. President Ibrahim Traoré's sweeping audit campaign didn't stop at ministries. It extended to foreign contracts, especially those signed under questionable terms, mining deals inked in backrooms with clauses written in languages few locals read. Within months, half a dozen operations were under review. One of them was Orvalis. When government auditors arrived with ledgers and legal teams, the company's executives didn't wait. They vanished. Not dramatically, just quietly. First, the trucks stopped running, then the offices were emptied. Finally, the gates were left swinging open in the dry wind. No statement, no press release. They left the mine like a broken promise. Most assumed the village of Biracora would crumble next. After all, its only real income had flowed from the mine's veins. But the people didn't leave. They stayed. At first, it was just a few former workers' men who had learned the rhythm of rock and earth with their own hands. Then came the farmers whose fields had dried from redirected water lines. Then the women who had washed uniforms, carried lunches, and watched their children grow sick from dust. They gathered under a tin roof with no fanfare, no bosses, no corporate handbooks, just memories of exploitation and a stubborn refusal to be left with nothing. Someone brought ledgers. Someone else printed handbills, "We dig for us now." Within weeks, the villagers of Biracora had formed an informal cooperative. No hierarchy, no military escort. Just an agreement signed by hand, an oath, equal pay, shared risk, full transparency. Every gram of gold extracted would be logged. Every sale recorded. Every profit reinvested not in stock options, but in schools, wells, and rice reserves. They called it Tilusoma, roughly what we earned we guard. Pickaxes replaced machines. Donkeys hauled where trucks once thundered. And yet production didn't halt, it adapted. Slower, yes, but cleaner. More honest. One man joked that the gold even smelled different now. By the third month, other villages were visiting, asking how they'd done it. Not because they wanted to be rich, but because they were tired of being bystanders to their own resources. Reporters came eventually. One tried to provoke outrage. "Don't you miss the jobs?" The security. An elder woman scarred from years of laundry near chemical waste replied plainly, "We don't miss being owned." Inside the old Orvalis control room, now a community storage hall, chalkboards listed daily totals. 2 school teachers handled accounting. A former night guard trained others in safety drills. Teenagers helped with sorting. The gold wasn't hoarded in vaults, but weighed and stored transparently until buyers local vetted could trade for grain tools and medicine. One evening, sitting around a fire after work, someone asked if Traoré knew what they were doing. A man named Yakuba, who had once been fired for organizing a strike, answered, "He gave us the space. We filled it. It wasn't rebellion, it was reclamation." In a world where wealth had long trickled upward, here was a village digging not just for gold, but for dignity. Every pickaxe stroke was a small act of defiance. Every honest ledger a rebuke to decades of extraction without compensation. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for help. They simply refused to be abandoned with their backs still bent. The mine may have been left behind, but the people of Biracora had stayed, and in their staying they struck something far rarer than gold ownership. The envelope arrived at the palace with no courier, no seal, no stamp of any embassy. It was delivered by a weathered man in a sun-bleached shirt, his feet dusty from a 2-day journey by bush taxi and borrowed bicycle. He left it at the front gate, said only, "It's for the president," from Biracora, and walked away before anyone could ask another question. Inside was a set of folded ledgers handwritten in ink and pencil. Each line meticulously marked, each page dated and signed, not by accountants in ties but by miners, teachers, farmers, and a midwife named Alima, who had overseen every birth in the village since the clinic reopened. There was no formal letter, only a cover page torn from the back of an old-school notebook with a sentence scrawled across it in careful handwriting, "We dig now for us, not for them." President Ibrahim Traoré sat in his private study late that night, reading through the ledgers by lamplight. He turned each page slowly, letting the numbers speak for themselves. Line by line, the record was clear. Yield from the Biracora mine, small, steady, consistent. Disbursements, 35% to education, 25% to a grain reserve, 20% to healthcare. The rest split equally among the cooperative's members. Expenses, tools, safety equipment, seedlings. No missing funds, no hidden transfers, no bribes. It was the most honest set of books he'd seen since taking office. Attached at the end were a handful of Polaroid photos, not for propaganda, but proof. One showed a new tin-roofed classroom with desks made from repurposed mine crates. Another captured a smiling nurse with her arms around 3 barefoot children. The last photo, blurred at the edges but full of sun, showed a group of villagers standing around a single young baobab tree, freshly planted in the dry red soil. Below the photo, someone had written, "We're putting them back now. 1 tree for every day the dust stole from us." TRAORÉ closed the folder gently as if it might break under the weight of what it represented. This wasn't charity. It wasn't foreign investment. It was something far rarer: accountability without pressure, prosperity without strings. A place where the end of corruption hadn't left a vacuum, it had made space for community. He stood from his desk and walked out onto the palace balcony, the cool air brushing against his face. Somewhere far south under that same sky, Biracora's people would be finishing their evening chores, tallying the day's output by lantern light, storing gold not in vaults but in the form of school meals and clean water. It would never make international news. No bank would give it a rating. No NGO would claim the credit. But this, he thought, this is the country we're trying to build. A place where justice wasn't just courtroom theater, but visible in daily life. A place where those once exploited could choose what to do with their own resources and walk with their heads unbowed. Not because someone gave them power, but because no one could take it away anymore. The next morning, TRAORÉ ordered the letter and ledger scanned and stored under a new file name, Village Sovereignty Model, Biracora. He made no speech about it. No televised visit. No medals. Just a memo sent quietly to the Ministry of Rural Development: send saplings to every co-op. Let them plant trees. The rest, they already know how to build. Because somewhere beyond the reach of corporations and contracts, a people had rewritten their story. And in the margins of dusty ledgers beside numbers and names, they had planted something deeper than gold. They had planted roots. The announcement came not in a televised speech, not with fanfare, and certainly not from a podium in the capital. It began as a bulletin posted on the side of a grain warehouse in Biracora. Just a single page stamped with the national crest and a title bold enough to stop people in their tracks: Ministry of Community Enterprise Decree 17/925. Presidential signature approved below it in plain language: objective: to recognize and support locally led economic initiatives. Mandate infrastructure, education, resource stewardship, and democratic profit sharing. First office, Biracora Cooperative Site. First appointed staff member, Yakuba Dumbia. No mention of elite consultants. No imported frameworks. No foreign advisors. The people read it twice, some even 3 times, unsure if it was real. Yakuba, once a laborer at the mine and later the informal record keeper of the co-op, was out behind the tool shed, fixing a broken axle when they found him. They held up the paper like it was a royal decree. He squinted at it, read it slowly, then laughed an honest, full laugh that carried across the red dust yard. They must have run out of ministers, he said, wiping his hands on his shirt. So they picked someone who never left. But that was exactly the point. The Ministry of Community Enterprise wasn't born from bureaucracy. It was born from necessity, from the undeniable success of Biracora and villages like it, who had proven that when power was kept, local corruption had less room to hide. TRAORÉ had watched from a distance as these cooperatives formed, not with instruction, but instinct. They had mined, shared, accounted, taught, planted. They had governed themselves quietly while the world looked elsewhere. So he built the ministry not to take control, but to learn. Its first office was a refurbished storage hall at the edge of the abandoned foreign mine, its walls still scarred from years of chemical wear. They painted it with leftover co-op paint, white walls, green trim, a mural of a baobab tree on the side roots winding down like veins. There was no ribbon cutting, no marching band, just a gathering: elders, school teachers, youth leaders, miners. They shared millet cakes and ginger water. Then they handed Yakuba his appointment letter. He held it in calloused hands, the official seal pressed like gold into the paper. He had never worn a suit. He had never held a government post. But now he was something no degree could bestow. The first public servant of a ministry born from sweat, not theory. Inside the ledgers from the co-op became the ministry's first archive. The classroom schedule became a blueprint. Their tree planting records became environmental policy drafts. And every document was written in Moré, Dula, and French because the law would no longer speak in a voice the people couldn't understand. One visiting official from the capital, puzzled by the unconventional setup, asked Yakuba what authority he thought he had. He pointed to the walls, to the chalkboards, to the ledgers. Authority, he said, that's paper. What we have here, what they built, is trust. And trust once earned in places where promises had always come with price tags was something far more powerful than any budget line. Word spread. Other villages sent letters. Some sent delegations. They wanted their own chapters, their own chance to run what had long been run over them. Back in the palace, when asked why he formalized the movement instead of regulating it, TRAORÉ answered with a single sentence. Because real power lives in the hands that stayed when everyone else left. The Ministry of Community Enterprise would grow, slowly, carefully, without the noise of politics but with the steady rhythm of people finally steering their own futures. It didn't need marble walls or expensive consultants. It had something better, a miner in dusty boots holding the pen of government. In the polished corridors of Burkina Faso's new government, where walls still whispered of the purge and the air remained tense with transformation, Minister Alan Zongo moved like a man untouched by gravity. He was everything the others were not. Where some ministers stumbled through reforms, Zongo glided through them, fluent in 5 languages with degrees from Geneva, Cape Town, and a fellowship in Brussels. His wardrobe was crisp but not flashy, his manner always polite but never passive. He shook hands, firmly bowed with just enough humility, and never raised his voice. More importantly, no one had ever found anything on him. No foreign wire transfers, no cousins with suspicious contracts, no trace of scandal in a cabinet where skeletons had tumbled out faster than policy drafts. He was by all appearances clean, cultured, untouchable. TRAORÉ had left him in place for those very reasons. Not out of trust, but caution. Zongo's Ministry of International Affairs was too strategic, too connected. And perhaps TRAORÉ had hoped Zongo's brilliance could be repurposed in service of this new national vision. But on this day in the presidential library, where afternoon sun bled through long drapes, Zongo sat across from TRAORÉ with the air of a man delivering inconvenient wisdom. A closed file rested on the table between them, thin, diplomatic, deliberate. "They're watching," Ibrahim Zongo said, using the president's first name, as only a handful still dared. The investors, the blocs, the donors, Brussels, Paris, Washington, even Kigali. TRAORÉ said nothing. He let the older man speak. "You've made a point," Zongo continued. "You've punished corruption, reshaped ministries, turned abandoned villages into headlines. But you can't run a country on moral victories." The phrase lingered. Zongo leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. His voice remained soft, never accusatory. "You have farmers planting trees, miners keeping ledgers. That's noble, beautiful even, but symbolic. The world runs on currency, not courage. Your stance in Brussels made waves, but waves crash eventually. And when they do, we'll need boats, loans, agreements." He opened the folder, an EU trade framework proposal. "This is a chance to pivot, to normalize, let the world exhale. No one's asking you to abandon your principles, just soften the edges." TRAORÉ looked at the proposal, but didn't touch it. "You think what we've built is symbolism?" he asked, voice steady. "It's romanticism," Zongo replied. "You've awakened the soul of the nation, yes, but you risk starving its body." The words weren't cruel. In fact, they carried concern. Zongo wasn't mocking TRAORÉ, he was warning him. But TRAORÉ had heard these tones before. In 2019, when generals told him not to lead patrols personally. In 2022, when they said a soldier couldn't govern. And now again, in tailored syntax, "Your ideals are admirable but unrealistic." He stood and walked to the window where the courtyard stretched out into the city beyond. He could see school children marching in neat rows, their shoes dusty, their uniforms mismatched but worn with pride. "I'd rather starve," Traoré said finally, "than feed the people with lies." Zongo rose too, closing the folder. "Then you may be the last one standing." Maybe, Traoré said, "but at least I'll be standing." The minister gave a quiet nod. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. He left without another word. Back in the courtyard, a gardener paused to watch him pass. Zongo adjusted his cuff, smiled politely, and disappeared down the marble steps, not a single crease in his composure. He was the kind of man the old world loved, sharp, smooth, scandal-free. But in this new era, Traoré was carving being untouchable didn't mean being incorruptible. It just meant you hadn't been touched yet. It began with a USB drive slipped under a locked office door. No note, no name. Just a silver key with red tape wrapped around it. Inside, thousands of documents, contracts, banking, slips, legal filings, emails translated into 3 languages. Someone had followed the money, and the money led to Alan Zongo. The audit didn't leak, it detonated. Shell companies in Dubai under obscure trade names. 2 vineyards in northern Portugal purchased through a Luxembourg holding group. Millions moved through anonymous offshore debt vehicles based in Mauritius. On paper, Zongo had no fingerprints. But the digital trail timestamps, matching email servers, internal memos, was forensic, undeniable. The worst wasn't that he had embezzled. The worst was how. He hadn't skimmed from ministry funds. He had engineered debt deals with foreign institutions, inflating loan conditions, inserting advisory fees and risk premiums into the contracts, then funneled the profits through intermediaries. Every time the country borrowed to build roads or clinics, Zongo made money. And during those years, as interest-mounted villages like Tanga and Bafora lost water access, their irrigation budgets quietly postponed. While the people waited for development, he harvested dividends from their debt. But Traoré didn't reveal the findings in a courtroom or on a national broadcast. He went to Ouagadougou University, into a public lecture hall, packed with students, activists, professors. No stage lights, no teleprompters, just a projector, a folding table, and the truth. He walked to the front holding a single folder, placed it beside the laptop, and began speaking not as a politician, but as a man unraveling a betrayal. "You were told corruption hides in shadows, that it lives in briefcases and backroom deals. But sometimes," he said, tapping a slide into place, "it hides in fluency, in titles, in clean suits and multilingual smiles." The first slide, a vineyard deed signed by a Shell director. Second, emails linking the Shell company to an encrypted server used by Zongo's legal advisor. Third, a contract showing inflated interest on a national infrastructure loan, with consulting routed through a firm co-owned by a Portuguese banker and a Burkinabe diplomat. Gasps rippled through the room. "You paid for this debt," Traoré continued. "Not with your votes, with your futures." Students stared, fists clenched, notebooks forgotten. A woman in the back wept quietly. A young man rose, whispering Zongo, as if the name itself had turned bitter in his mouth. Then the final slide. He said, "I couldn't run a country on moral victories," Traoré said. "But if this is what victory without morals looks like, then we were never a country, we were a client." He shut off the projector. Now, he said calmly, "We audit everything." Outside, the sun beat down hard. But inside the lecture hall, a chill had settled, because the untouchable had been touched. And what spilled out wasn't just wealth. It was rot in fluent disguise. The lecture hall was still buzzing when the live stream ended. Across the Capitol, in a private study surrounded by imported books and framed degrees, Alan Zongo sat, motionless, eyes fixed on the tablet screen that had just broadcast the collapse of his legacy. He didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He just exhaled as if he'd been holding that breath for years. Then, almost methodically, he opened the drawer beside him and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, thick paper, embossed seal. Inside, folded with military precision, was a resignation letter signed weeks ago. Dated. Stamped. No one had forced it yet, but he had known. He read it one last time before sealing it again. Then, with a hint of a smile, half sad, half resigned, he whispered to the silence, "You thought this would never end." The envelope was delivered to the palace that same evening. No guards came, no arrest, no spectacle. Just a name removed from a doorplate, another powerful man quietly undone by the truth. But the story didn't end with resignation. 3 days later, the Public Holdings Transparency Act passed unanimously through Parliament. For the first time in national history, every government official's assets, holdings, and family-linked enterprises would be publicly listed, audited, and archived. No exceptions, not even the president. We cannot demand trust, TRAORÉ said in the chamber, if we still keep secrets. But the true turning point came a week after in a crowded university hall, the same place the audit had been revealed. The course was Modern Governance Accountability. The lecturer had planned to cancel that day, but instead he offered his podium to a guest, the student who had stood during TRAORÉ's audit, and asked the first question. She stepped forward nervously, holding only a notebook. "I'm not a professor," she began, "but I watched a man profit while we rationed water. I watched another man expose him without needing an army. And I realized, maybe this is what nation building actually looks like." She paused, then smiled. Lesson 1. You can serve your country without selling it. The room erupted in quiet applause. And far from that classroom, somewhere in the corner of the country, a minor-turned-civil servant sat reading the transcript and nodded slowly. The era of untouchables had ended. The era of accountability had begun. At dawn, palace staff quietly removed the last of the old foreign flags, lining the grand corridor symbols of deals, debts, and past dependence. In their place, they hang hand-sewn banners from across the country, simple flags stitched by villagers marked with rivers, cows, baobab trees, and millet. A young girl touring the palace tugs her mother's hand and asks a guard, "Where's the old flag?" President TRAORÉ, passing by, hears her and smiles. "It's in our hearts," he replies, "but not on our contracts anymore." The hallway is silent, but the message is loud. The country belongs to its people again. There's no farewell parade, no broadcast speech, just a press release, one page: "I will not seek re-election." He leaves the palace in the early morning with a single suitcase, his boots dusty. No bodyguards, no fanfare. On his desk, aides later find a handwritten note left half-crumpled near the bin. "We didn't cleanse a cabinet, we cleansed a conscience." It's framed months later in the new National Museum. Not because of its elegance, but because of its honesty. A new parliament building rises not from imported marble, but from wood sourced from every province. It is built by local carpenters paid using funds seized from corruption trials. Inside, murals painted by school children cover the walls. On the ceiling, a map of the country without borders, just rivers connecting all regions. Outside, a crowd gathers not to cheer a name, but to witness a new kind of history. In the final narration, a soft voice says, "He did not reign, he repaired." And the country once broken by silence stood whole. No statues are raised, no streets renamed. But across the land, the flag stitched from many hands now flies high. And beneath it, a people remember not just the man, but the moment they stood on their own. In a world where power often corrupts, TRAORÉ's story reminds us that true leadership begins with conscience, not control. He didn't rise to dominate, but to restore what was lost: dignity, justice, and the voice of the unheard. His quiet departure speaks louder than any speech, a legacy not carved in stone, but in people's memory. This is more than a political tale. It's a blueprint for courage, humility, and change. What would our communities look like if more leaders chose service over status, and if more citizens believed they deserved nothing less? If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.